Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763 to 1766, stands as a significant but often overlooked chapter in the history of North America, reflecting the tense and shifting dynamics between Native American tribes, British settlers, and the British military in the wake of the French and Indian War. This conflict, which saw various indigenous tribes unite under the leadership of Ottawa leader Pontiac, aimed to resist British encroachment and policies that threatened indigenous lands and ways of life. The rebellion underscored deep-rooted tensions, influenced British colonial policy in North America, and laid the groundwork for future Native American resistance movements. The roots of Pontiac's rebellion were embedded in the outcome of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. The war, fought between Britain and France, resulted in a British victory and the transfer of French territories in North America to British control. Prior to the war, the French had established relatively cooperative relationships with many Native American tribes. French traders often married into indigenous communities, integrated into their social networks, and respected tribal autonomy, which helped build trust and alliances. In contrast, the British arrived with an intent to control, enforce strict policies, and demand obedience from the native peoples, showing little understanding or respect for indigenous customs and sovereignty. When the French influence waned and British colonial officials assumed power, tribes that had formerly allied with the French grew wary of British intentions, leading to a volatile and tense atmosphere in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes regions. One of the main grievances of the indigenous tribes involved in Pontiac's rebellion was the British policy changes implemented by General Geoffrey Amherst, the British Governor-General. Amherst, known for his rigid views on indigenous affairs, introduced several policies aimed at reducing British expenditures in North America. He ordered the cessation of the gift-giving tradition previously practiced by the French, which involved offering material goods to indigenous leaders to affirm alliances. To the native tribes, these gifts were not mere material objects but essential symbols of mutual respect and friendship. Amherst also restricted the supply of gunpowder and ammunition to native groups, viewing them as potential threats rather than allies. This restriction was particularly harsh, as firearms had become essential for indigenous communities to hunt and defend themselves. The sudden cutoff signaled to many tribes that the British did not value or respect their relationship and were preparing to dominate them by force if necessary. Pontiac, an Ottawa leader with a strong reputation and a keen awareness of the shifting political landscape, emerged as a prominent figure in the movement against British oppression. Pontiac held deep respect within his community and wielded influence over several tribes in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions. His leadership was marked by a combination of strategic acumen and charisma, qualities that made him well-suited to unite a coalition of diverse tribes. Pontiac recognized that only through unity could the indigenous tribes hope to present a significant challenge to British power. Drawing inspiration from earlier prophetic figures such as Neolin, a Lenape prophet who preached a return to traditional native customs and a rejection of European goods and influences, Pontiac framed his struggle as a spiritual and cultural resistance against the European settlers who threatened their very existence. In early 1763, Pontiac began to organize a coordinated attack against British forts and settlements throughout the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes. His plan was audacious and ambitious, calling for a multi-pronged offensive that would disrupt British supply lines and spread fear throughout the frontier. Pontiac sought alliances with various tribes, including the Ojibwe, Huron, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Lenape, creating a coalition that shared a mutual distrust of British intentions. The rebellion officially began in May 1763 with an assault on Fort Detroit, a well-defended British outpost. Though Pontiac's attempt to take the fort through a surprise attack ultimately failed, the siege continued for months, drawing significant British resources and attention. This prolonged resistance at Fort Detroit demonstrated the determination and resolve of the indigenous forces and inspired similar uprisings across the region. Throughout the summer and fall of 1763, indigenous forces attacked British forts and settlements with remarkable success. They captured Fort Sandusky, Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Weatnagon, Fort Miami, and Fort Venango, among others, often through cunning tactics and overwhelming force. These victories were marked by intense violence, as the indigenous warriors sought to expel the British presence entirely. For the native forces, these attacks were not only a strategic means of reclaiming territory, but also a message of defiance against British authority. The rebellion, however, was not without brutal retaliation, as British soldiers responded with equal ferocity. Numerous villages and settlements faced violent reprisals from the British military, sparking a cycle of retribution that only intensified the conflict. The rebellion reached its height during 1763, with British forces struggling to contain the indigenous resistance. Reports of attacks and massacres reached British authorities, causing widespread fear and panic among settlers. In some areas, settlers abandoned their homes and fled eastward to seek refuge from the uprising. The scale of the conflict forced British authorities to acknowledge the depth of native grievances and the potential threat posed by a united indigenous front. British commanders, now realizing the limitations of their military power, began to question Amherst's policies, as the reduction in gift-giving and ammunition had directly contributed to the escalation of violence. Amherst's eventual recall to Britain marked a turning point in British strategy. He was replaced by General Thomas Gage, who recognized that military force alone would not quell the rebellion. Gage took a more diplomatic approach, offering to resume the gift-giving practices and restore some of the trust that had been eroded under Amherst's leadership. However, Pontiac and his followers remained skeptical of British intentions, aware that these concessions could be temporary and that the British might only be seeking to pacify the region until they regained control. Even so, the British initiated peace negotiations, understanding that they could not afford to sustain a prolonged and costly conflict in the frontier. The rebellion gradually lost momentum as British forces regained control of key forts, and several tribes began to withdraw from the conflict, either due to exhaustion or British diplomatic efforts. By 1764, some indigenous leaders had entered into peace negotiations with British officials, and skirmishes became less frequent. However, Pontiac himself continued to resist, holding out for better terms and assurances of indigenous sovereignty. In 1766, Pontiac finally agreed to a formal peace agreement with British officials, though it was evident that the conditions he sought for his people's freedom and autonomy had not been fully met. The legacy of Pontiac's rebellion was profound, influencing British colonial policy and shaping future relations between Native American tribes and European settlers. In response to the uprising, the British government issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, a landmark document that attempted to limit the westward expansion of settlers and establish a boundary between colonial lands and native territories. While the proclamation was intended to prevent further conflicts by creating a buffer zone, it was deeply unpopular among settlers who viewed it as an infringement on their rights. Many ignored the boundary, pushing westward into indigenous lands, sowing the seeds for further confrontations. The proclamation demonstrated the British government's acknowledgement of native concerns, yet it also exposed the difficulty of enforcing such policies, especially given the widespread resistance from settlers. Pontiac's rebellion left a lasting impact on Native American communities, instilling a sense of unity and resilience that would carry forward into future resistance movements. Although Pontiac's coalition ultimately dissolved and many tribes faced severe challenges in the following decades, the rebellion had shown that indigenous forces could mount a powerful resistance against colonial powers when united by common goals. The rebellion also served as a powerful symbol of indigenous autonomy and resistance against European encroachment, inspiring other native leaders in later conflicts. For the British, the rebellion underscored the complexities of governing an empire with diverse populations and the need to consider indigenous rights and grievances more carefully in colonial policy. Pontiac himself remained a notable figure among his people, though he was never able to achieve the full realization of his vision. After the rebellion, he continued to advocate for indigenous unity, seeking to prevent further loss of land and culture. Tragically, he was assassinated by a Peoria warrior in 1769, a testament to the fractured alliances and divisions that persisted among indigenous communities. His death marked the end of an era, but did not diminish the significance of his legacy. Pontiac's rebellion remains a powerful example of indigenous resistance, a testament to the resilience of Native American tribes in the face of colonial pressures, and a reminder of the struggles that defined the early history of North America. The rebellion was not just a conflict over territory, but a struggle for cultural survival, sovereignty, and respect, themes that continue to resonate in indigenous communities to this day.